one of my favorite segments every day, and that's a little something we call Chat with Pat.
Yeah, today we have an individual who wrote an article in First Things, Joshua Treviño. He is the Senior Director of the Western Hemisphere Initiative at America First Policy Institute. And the name of the article is Europe's Fate is America's Business. An interesting article. Joshua, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, this was a very interesting article because certainly I listened to Secretary of State Marco Rubio's speech in, I think it was in Germany, correct? And where he talked about how we're all connected and security, and he did such a wonderful job with that. And one of the quotes you use is, United States and Europe are part of one civilization forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices of our forefathers made together for the common civilization to which we have fallen heir. So I'm going to jump in there and ask you, how is America affected by the fate of Europe?
Well, great question. There have been many people over many years, centuries actually, who have tried to advance the thesis that America no longer needs to look to Europe in any way.
Right.
But the reality, which most of our founding fathers understood, and I think certainly Secretary of State Rubio well understands, as does President Trump, is that Europe and the United States do form one common civilization. The United States is a creation of a specifically Anglo-American inheritance in our historical case. And of course, we incorporate within ourselves many peoples of many origins, but predominantly from a European context, which is defined overall and surpassingly by its Christian heritage. And without that heritage, America is incomprehensible. America is not possible without it. And so to your question, we have to care what's happening to Europe, because what happens to Europe inevitably happens to us, and vice versa. And so we're passengers in an ark together, metaphorically speaking, and so we ought to have care to what happens to the other passengers.
So can you give us some current? I mean, I think a lot of people understand historically. Of course, we got our people that came over were from Europe that started, the United States in a sense. So, but I think maybe they have a harder time understanding today that connection. So can you give us maybe some current ways that our civilization is affected by Europe and how that occurs?
Oh, absolutely. Look, let me give you a material answer first, and then I'll give you a cultural one. The material answer is that from a security standpoint, this has been true across the past 400 years. Every time there's a general war in Europe, the United States gets drawn in, and that's for very deep reasons of American security and trade. And so that mechanism is not over by any stretch, and so it's something that those of us who care about peace in the world need to be concerned with. But on the cultural front and on the governance front, what we find is that the intellectual and ideological currents that start in Europe or in the United States always cross the Atlantic, and so depending on one's own political preferences, and I obviously have my own. I'm a little bit right of center, you might say. But even if you're not, what has to be understood is that when ideas originate in one area, they go to the other. The intellectual currents that produce, for example, the administrative state in the United States really started in Germany in the second half of the 19th century. Similarly, too, we see in the United Kingdom now, a lot of the dysfunction there actually comes from the importation of ideas from the United States that aren't necessarily appropriate to the British context. So, we have to be aware that we don't have the luxury of looking away because the interchange between the peoples remains as vital now as it ever has been.
One of the terms that you used in this article is civilization erasure. Can you kind of explain that? And is there a tipping point in that? How does that affect us?
Absolutely. Look, one of the reasons that we have states and nations in the Western concept is to defend the inheritance and the way of life and what the American founders called the posterity of the individual peoples. And what we see in Europe, and we see this in the United States too, unfortunately, but it's much more advanced in Europe, is a lot of these states no longer care to defend those things. And in fact, they work actively against them. So when you think about the things that would define European or American civilization, that Christian inheritance that we talked about, the concept of individual rights, the inheritance of liberty, and then the particular languages and peoples bearing the history that they do, throughout the continent and throughout America as well. If you have states that don't defend those things, or if you have states that work to erase them, either through the imposition of new ideologies or the erasure of faith, or unfortunately sometimes the importation of peoples who do not share those values, then you are looking at what we can call civilizational erasure. And what the Secretary of State, I think, very correctly pointed out is a mortal threat to Europe as such. There is no Europe without Europeans. That's not a racial statement. It's not even really an ethnic statement, but it's a cultural and it's a philosophical one, and it's one that a lot of the European states have forgotten.
Do you think there is, because we have become a world where travel is so easy and we just go from one place to another very easily, the idea of trying to maintain a culture or a civilization, is that more difficult now? Because we certainly want to be more diverse. We have a pluralistic kind of sense in the world, but yet we haven't kind of figured out how do you make that work without those countries then becoming balkanized themselves.
It absolutely is possible to maintain cultural identity and to defend one's inheritance. And in fact, I would argue it's necessary to do so for the sake of not even set aside any kind of corporate or group survival, but for the sake of one's individual soul. That is something that we have to do. We have no choice but as to whether or not we have a culture. The only question is what kind of culture we have. And
right.
So to your point, we do live in an era in which it's possible to travel, in which there's many different communities and so on. But let's not forget, and I think this is appropriate to mention on the Catholic Radio Network, that the very earliest Christians had to maintain themselves and their faith and their communities in a very deeply hostile environment for centuries. And they didn't do so by retreating into ethnic enclaves or balkanizing themselves. They did it by participating in the world and being the salt and light. And that's something I think that we, whether you're of European descent or not, but certainly if you are a beneficiary of European heritage, which everybody in America is, that's an example that we have to look to.
Yeah. I love, too, how you talk about the philia and telos of that Aristotle talks about, defining a nation state. What is its meaning and purpose? And I think so often we're not even sure what our values are at any given time in our country. Do you think that?
I absolutely agree with that, and rediscovering those values is absolutely essential to securing our own future. Because if we do that, if we rediscover what America is for, and this is true for the European nations too, and in the American case, what America is for is liberty, understood in a historically Christian context.
Yeah.
Then we're going to persist unto generations, and if we don't, then we won't. Unfortunately, it's that binary.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Joshua, for being with us today. Have a great week ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.